Chris said, I'm Jason Marzik. I'm the director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. It's great to see so many old and new friends today for Tax Day. Thanks for coming out for that. This discussion really comes at a critical moment for Mexico, U.S.-Mexico relations, Latin America, and the world. And Chris, want to reiterate your message. I want to thank Woodrow Wilson Center, the Mexican Institute, for hosting today's discussion with us, and also thank you to McClarty Associates for their help as well as putting this event together. And Dr. Márquez, great to have you here. We just came from a lunchtime discussion. I think all of you will be in for an incredible treat to hear directly from her some of the policy priorities for the Andrés Manuel López Obrador campaign. Dr. Márquez joins us at a critical moment where we're looking at Mexico's future on both trade and economic development, especially as we're looking at the upcoming elections. As all of you know, Dr. Márquez as well is not only a member of AMLO's team, but was also named by AMLO to be economy minister if he is elected president. And so, Graciela, we look forward to your comments. As Chris was saying, I'd also like to announce today that this is also the first of a three-part series at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Woodrow Wilson Mexico Institute. We'll be doing on the Mexico campaign. Dr. Márquez is the first of three speakers. Over the next few weeks, we'll be hosting two additional events with advisors to Mexico's other top candidates on April. Mark your calendars, April 24th. We'll host Sergio Alcocer from Jose Antonio Meade's team. And then on May 2nd, we'll host Salomon Chertorivsky from Ricardo Anaya's campaign. And both of those events, those next two events will be at the Atlantic Council, but in partnership with the Woodrow Wilson Institute, with Chris and Duncan specifically, and also Catherine Pereira on my team who manages our Mexico work. As all of you know, in 2.5 months, about 10 weeks or so from now, the Mexican people, probably doesn't seem like it's doesn't come soon enough, right? The Mexican people will be going to the voting booth to elect their next president. I think at a time of unprecedented transformation, but also uncertainty. Frankly, on a global scale about where we are going, particularly on issues of trade and economic development. And as Mexico faces the incredibly daunting task of ensuring inclusive economic growth, its next leader will also, of course, need to navigate the current dynamics of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and those bilateral relations. All of you are very familiar with the polls. Latest polls have Andrés Manuel López Obrador leading the presidential race with 38% support, Ricardo Anaya with 20%, and Jose Antonio Meade with 16% of the vote. And that is as we are approaching this Sunday, the first debate of the candidates. At the Atlantic Council, we really see this moment in Mexico and in the Americas as an inflection point. Global forces are changing dramatically, and I think at a speed that we've never seen before. Uncertainty, unpredictability continue to loom over businesses, individuals, and trade relationships overall. And I think that today's discussion is a key opportunity to hear directly from Dr. Márquez about, within that context, to hear about the policy priorities for AMLO, specifically around trade and economic issues. I think many at the Atlantic Council, and I think all of us in this room as well appreciate how important Mexico is as an indispensable ally for the United States. Its efforts not only as a commercial partner, but its efforts in drug interdiction, its votes with the U.S. at the United Nations, and its anti-terrorist cooperation are also invaluable as part of that relationship. Intelligence sharing between our respective security agencies has also neutralized many threats before they reach our border. And that just fundamentally explains kind of how important that relationship is on so many different levels, at the national level and at the state level, at the local level. And I think that this is also a key moment to think about the importance of NAFTA. Mexico, of course, as all of you know, is the U.S.'s third largest trading partner, but not only at an aggregate level, the work of the Atlantic Council, the great work that the Mexico Institute here has done as well, to really showcase how many states depend on U.S.-Mexico trade, from Texas to Michigan, Arizona to Ohio to Louisiana. State-level exports to Mexico surpass $5 billion. And there's a lot of concern at a state level on where we're going to be going on NAFTA negotiations and what that means for U.S. business. Dr. Marquez, I think we very much look forward to hearing from you, what your vision is, what the AMLO's vision is for Mexico moving forward. And I just want to close by again thanking the Wilson Center for working with us on this, and turn it over now to you, Chris, for this carrying us forward on the conversation.
Thanks so much, Jason. Graciela, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
You have a presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for the interest you may show for this presentation. So I have prepared a very brief presentation, and actually I would be glad to hear your questions and be happy to answer your comments. So this is, well, first I just need to say that I'm not only a El Colegio de Mexico researcher, but also an affiliate. I have a current affiliation at the U.S. Mexico Studies Center at UC San Diego, where I'm currently spending my sabbatical year. So it's fair to recognize my UCSD affiliation. This is the GDP in Mexico over the 1 century. Mexico experienced a great transformation in the 20th century with with a sustained economic growth from 1932 to 1981. Half a century of growth. Every single year of those 50 years, Mexico was growing at a positive rate. And after 1981, Mexico faced some troubles, particularly because of the over-indebted crisis. And since then on, since 1981 to the present, GDP per capita have increased on a very low levels, averaging 0.5% over that period. So Mexico really needs to grow, because the lack of growth over 3 decades have created a lot of problems in terms of poverty and inequality. But not only that, Mexico stopped growing at or grew at a very low levels, and that produced an increasing gap between the U.S. and Mexico. Up until the early 1980s, Mexico was closing the gap between the economic performance with the U.S. in terms of levels. After 1981, we are now more and more separated from the U.S. So, despite NAFTA and despite many other economic forces that integrated these two economies, now we are at the level of the 1950s in regards to the economic level of the U.S. So that those things, I decided to start this presentation with these two long-term issues to make a point of why Mexico needs to grow. So,
it's not changing on the screen.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Oh, that's okay. Thank you.
Yep.
So that I was referring to that increasing gap. All these different. These are all estimations of GDP per capita ratio of the U.S. So we were closer than ever in the early 1980s to the United States in terms of economic level. Mexico was converging to the U.S. After the 1981, Mexico diverged from the U.S. So that is important because in an economic program, you aim at closing the gap with your major trading partner. So, what do we know about NAFTA? We know that NAFTA created substantial increases in trade and in FDI, foreign investment, in the Mexican economy, but has a mixed effect on wages, employment, and well-being in general. NAFTA was, of course, a trade agreement. We cannot ask NAFTA to resolve all Mexican problems, but it had effects on different aspects of the economy. And one expected result, according to the trade models in which NAFTA was built on, was convergence on wages, and that hasn't happened. The gap of wages in the auto industry remain very large. Wages in the auto industry now in Mexico, hourly wages are $3 per hour, whereas in the United States is $26 per hour. Sorry, not 26, $15 per hour. So there is a 5-time gap between these two wages in the United States and in Mexico. One expected result of NAFTA was the reduction in this gap, but that didn't happen. Another effect of NAFTA was that Mexico became more integrated, the economic cycle became more integrated with that of the US. So we were on a diverging path in terms of economic levels, but Mexico was more and more reacting to external shocks similarly to what was happening in the US. So you see that before NAFTA, let me see if I can. I always have troubles with
It's very hard on the screen. It doesn't
Okay.
work very well.
Before NAFTA, you see that the Mexican economic cycle and the US cycles were not really synchronized. After NAFTA, there is almost a perfect synchronization of cycles. That was very positive when the US economy was growing in the 1990s. And so we took part of that impulse. But in 2009, when the crisis hit, it was an external crisis, and it hit the Mexican economy much more than any other Latin American countries. The average Latin American country, I'll stop watching my computer. So in the Latin American countries, the average decrease was 1.9%. In the Mexican case, was 7%. And this is due to the synchronization of economic cycles. So what was good in good times, Mexico took the opportunity to grow very fast. And in downturns, Mexico was hard hit. Even though Mexico was well prepared, the 2009 crisis was not a crisis produced in Mexico or being provoked by Mexico macroeconomic mismanagement, but it was a crisis coming from outside. But still, it was very hard hit. Another result is that nowadays, poverty levels in Mexico are at similar levels of the early 1990s. At the same, right before the NAFTA agreement, poverty levels, the Mexican 53% of the Mexican population was under the line, was categorized as poor, as poor. Now it's 53. So there was no poverty alleviation over the long term with NAFTA. NAFTA produced a huge superávit with the United States, but also a huge superávit with non-NAFTA countries, so that the deficit remained, and Mexico's current trade, its Mexico has a current trade deficit since then. And these are now scholars and policymakers are discussing if we need to take into account not gross trade flows, but what is called trading value added. Because if we take into account trading value added, the $60 billion deficit with the US could be reduced to $10 billion around. Why? Because it's not the flow of goods, but it's just what it's incorporated into in Mexico, how Mexican workers, Mexican firms transform exports. So, in any ways, the superávit, the Mexican trade superávit remains, even though if we take trade in value-added figures. So we have very mixed, it's a mix, NAFTA produced a very mixed bag results. What we can affirm is that NAFTA didn't take all the jobs from the US economy. It's actually, that graph shows you that that's true. Some employment moved to Mexico during the 1990s, but the huge impact was due to China entering into the WTO around the early in this century and the heat of the financial crisis. So job destruction was not a result, an immediate result of NAFTA. Job destruction was a result of other aspects of the global connections of the US. So this is just a brief introduction of what it is, the economic outlook of the last quarter of a century when NAFTA was signed. In this outlook then, I would like to present what is the economic platform of candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador and how he would tackle some of the existing problems and some of the strengths of the Mexican economy. First of all, what we have to think of is his performance, the performance of Manuel López Obrador during his, I'm sorry, his performance during, yeah, please do.
Yeah.
I'm watching.
No, please go ahead.
His performance during his government in Mexico City. He became mayor of Mexico City in the election of 2000, and in that government, the performance was he followed a fiscal responsible government. He invested in infrastructure, in roads connecting different parts of the city. He engaged in public-private partnership projects, especially for the modernization of the Centro Histórico, and he implemented social programs to vulnerable population, especially a sort of targeted all people pension. So that's what López Obrador did during his tenure as mayor of Mexico City. There was no ramping inflation. There was no scare of foreign investors or domestic investors. There was not a huge deficit or over-indebtedness. That didn't happen during the 5 years he ran the capital city of Mexico. And that performance as during his government is reflected on what he's proposing on his campaign platform this time. He's again stressing fiscal responsibility, and He's committed to prudent debt management. And this is particularly important because this past government, the current government, the Peña Nieto government, led a public debt policy that peaked last year. And last year, the public indebtedness reached 53.7%. Since 2014, IMF officials have reported that Mexico needed to control the growth of the public debt. It became a problem, the public, in the eyes of the IMF, the debt became a problem in Mexico. So Lopez Obrador is committed not only not to indebt the country, but to tackle an already existing problem with the debt. So the debt now is 53% of GDP. He's also committed to not to implement a new tax reform. He wants to have the tax reform that it's already in place, that was implemented in the current government. And a common question is the new government react to the tax reform that was passed here in the United States in past December? And the idea is that it is not necessary because even though the nominal rates are differ, the effective rate in Mexico is very similar to that of the US because we don't have income tax, a state level income tax. It's just federal taxation. So if you compare the effective rate is pretty similar. And Lopez Obrador has also committed to more efficient expenditure. One recommendation he has asked to all of his collaborators and possible secretaries in his cabinet, he has asked us to be careful of budget control. That is to say, in Mexico, Congress approves the budget, but then the government usually overspends. He wants us to commit to what is approved by Congress, to adjust the bureaucratic structures, and to follow a very transparent policy in how the revenue is spent. And in complement with fiscal responsibility, Lopez Obrador would follow, it's not that he would follow, he would commit to the independence of Bank of Mexico. My colleague Carlos Ursúa, who's been appointed Hacienda Ministry in the possible government of Lopez Obrador, he always said that we have to repeat that. It's not that we're not. It's very important for us that there is a constitutional mandate of the independence of the Bank of Mexico, and this would continue to do so, and it would be the mandate, the central bank mandate is inflation control. We also believe that the best way to react to foreign impacts or shocks is through a regime of exchange rate flexibility. So these are the monetary issues and the fiscal issues that are strong commitments in the Lopez Obrador agenda. On the other hand, trying to tackle the problem of very low economic growth, remember, this 0.5 per capita over the last 3 decades, the Lopez Obrador platform proposes to invest in infrastructure. Public investment last year, in 2017, was 2% of GDP. the lowest level in the last 3 decades, 2% of GDP. This is low for almost every country in the world. It's really very low levels of 2%. Paradoxically, this very low level of public investment was taking place at the time that the Mexican government was, the public debt was increasing. So the debt was increasing, whereas the public investment was in a very low level. So we believe there is room for investment, for public investment in infrastructure. Public investment that would go to roads, ports of entry, railroads, innovation hubs, because we believe that if the country wants to work, to grow, it needs to be done by innovation. And to secondary education, we also need to educate our workforce. Another pressing issue is NAFTA. As you know, NAFTA is being negotiated since last August, and as we speak, negotiators are working very hard to tackle some of the, they're called poison pills in the agreement. As negotiators, we believe that we need the best agreement possible. And this has been a commitment by the current administration. The AMLO economic platform believe in global forces, believe in the idea that Mexico needs to remain open, because NAFTA had increased not only trade but also foreign investment, and so it really needs to be open to global economic forces. And by negotiating NAFTA, after a quarter of a century of its initial implementation, it needed modernization. We agreed that NAFTA needed modernization, and we also agree that then if NAFTA is signed before the election, we would work very hard for its implementation. It's not only crucial to sign NAFTA, but also to implement what is being signed. For instance, in the auto industry, of the regional content, if there are some changes to be implemented, the Mexican government needs to follow up on this implementation so that we can reach the goal of getting the best deal possible. Otherwise, if NAFTA negotiations do not end this spring, in May or in June, we are prepared to continue the negotiations to the point in which they are now, or it could be in the following weeks. We have a team already working and following what is happening in NAFTA every day, and those negotiations would be led by myself and by an important Mexican economist, Jesus Seade. He was vice president of the WTO, and he has accepted the challenge of accompanying the NAFTA renegotiation. But of course, there is now some of these, what the press usually refer as the poison pills. Our idea on some of these issues is that regional content changes should preserve the region's competitiveness. That means that we are modernizing NAFTA, and NAFTA has been very important. NAFTA is the scenario in which investors act upon Mexico and the United States. We need a NAFTA, and we need the best NAFTA possible, but we need to think not only in terms of Mexico or the United States or Canada, we need to think in terms of the region. We need to strengthen North America to be prepared to the new challenges of the 21st century. We also need to preserve what was one of the main innovations of NAFTA in the 1990s. In the 1990s, NAFTA innovated in the way it protected investment through chapters 11, chapter 19, and chapter 20. These chapters provided certainty to investors. We hope that negotiators, as they have already declared to the press, they would attempt to preserve these innovations on the new NAFTA treaty. We will certainly be vigilant if we negotiate NAFTA, that these innovations, that the dispute resolution would be in place in the new NAFTA. We need a NAFTA 2.0. We don't need a NAFTA 0.5. We need to preserve what was and what has worked well for NAFTA. So it is, for us, it's very, very important to provide certainty to investors. The same with the sunset clause. NAFTA needs to send the signal that it provides an investors enough time to plan investments in Mexico. I was saying that it's that this uncertainty that might be caused by the sunset clause, the idea of revising NAFTA every 5 years, would just be as if we were negotiating NAFTA all the time. Imagine that if we accept regional content changes and wage increases in the auto sector, there would be a 3-year transitional period. If we accept the sunset clause, then once the transitional period ends, then we will start negotiating NAFTA again. So we would be like experts on negotiating NAFTA, ongoing negotiation. And that is not good for investors, and that is not good also for what NAFTA effects on the economies. We didn't negotiate NAFTA for 25 years. And maybe that was a signal that NAFTA was working, and that NAFTA, with some discontent and with some losers and some gains, NAFTA was working. Maybe we should have negotiated before, renegotiated before. But in any case, it was a quarter of a century that NAFTA was in effect, and NAFTA was working. So we don't need to renegotiate every 5 years, but we have to be aware that we might be renegotiating NAFTA maybe not in 20 years from now, but we have to be flexible in that, but certainly not with the sunset clause. I would hope that the major problem in the Mexican economy would be negotiating NAFTA, but unfortunately it is not. There are many other challenges in the Mexican economy. I don't have time to go in detail to any of them, but I just point out some of the problems that the economic platform of Lopez Obrador takes into account. Informality remains very high in the country. 57% of workers belong to the informal sector. So there is a huge opportunity to work there. That's why it's not only the global economy that should worry a new government. There are many other pressing issues that need to be addressed. That's why Lopez Obrador proposes a virtuous combination of global forces plus domestic market. We need to strengthen the Mexican domestic market so that we can provide some answers to some problems that are related directly to informality, to low levels of education, of poverty, whereas at the same time we have to find new partnerships in North America and in the global economy. How do we propose to resolve these huge levels of informality? Through regulatory reform, the use of digital technology, support for micro, small, and medium firms, but perhaps more importantly, to support directly those who are in the informal economy. And for that, we don't need money. We need to channel and to educate people. Let me just give very briefly an idea of how I'm envisioning to tackle informality. Imagine a taco shop owner in Mexico City. He doesn't pay taxes, and he doesn't know how to pay taxes. He has never paid taxes, ever. He doesn't have a Registro Federal de Causantes, an IRS, and sort of a social security number or something like that. What if, and then the crime organizations came and asked him for money, the crime tax, say. What if we implement an information courses in which they can get their tax number, in which they can, with that tax number or the certification of this course, they can go and get credit in banks. And the bank can provide some credit to buy a better place to sell the tacos. So there is room for informality, and we don't need much money to implement those programs. And we can pull some part of the informality into the formal economy, and we can help the well-being of those workers. Imagine also that deportees can receive this support and move away from Tijuana, move away from the border, and go back to their original communities with a certification, with the skills, incorporate them. Once deported, we can incorporate them not to the informal economy, not to the crime organizations. We can incorporate them to the formal sector. And I need really to stop here, but there are many other challenges. One of them is the 2% GDP of the pension system that needs to be resolved. So there is ahead also this problem of the federal pension system. That's why we need to be very fiscal responsible. We know the challenges of being fiscal responsibility, because otherwise we wouldn't not only solve the problems, but we need to solve the problems, and the problems needs the best way is to pursue fiscal responsibility. Many thanks for your attention, and I will be glad to answer your questions. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you for such a clear presentation on those priorities and on the impact of trade in Mexico. We're going to have some time for questions with the audience. I'm going to take advantage of my space as moderator to start us off with a question. And I think you're the person that's probably the most prepared to answer this question that I can think of as someone who's both an economist and a historian. You started us off with a graph showing sort of different periods of growth in Mexico. And we've actually heard from Andrés Manuel López Obrador that he would be interested in returning to some of that period of stabilizing growth from the 1950s and 60s in Mexico, when there was pretty steady growth without so many shocks to the economy. But Mexico is very different now. Right, and you've made it very clear that you don't really have an intention, the campaign does not have an intention of taking Mexico back to a period of import substitution with high tariff walls and detaching Mexico from the global economy and NAFTA. So what does that mean then? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to, what are the lessons from that period that can be taken that are truly still applicable today in a modern Mexico that is incredibly integrated into a global economy and into the North American economy?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's not a return to protectionism. It's not a return to the Mexico of the 50s and 60s, because we cannot return also the global economy. The global economy has also changed. That economy is the economy of the Bretton Woods Accords. No, basically what Lopez Obrador is referring to a period in which public investment was crucial and complementary to private investment. If you compare the levels of public investment back then and now are completely different. So that is the kind of idea of not returning by taking that lesson, the lesson of how important can be public investment in providing good conditions for private investment. What economists call the crowding in phenomenon effect.
Thank you very much. So yeah, let's open it up to some of the questions. I have several more, but let me first turn to the audience. So Kevin Middlebrook, who is, as he mentioned at the beginning, is a fellow with us right now, as well as a professor, long time studying U.S.-Mexico relations. Go ahead.
I have two questions, one about minimum wages and one about labor productivity. My understanding is that Lopez Obrador proposes to raise minimum wages over a 6-year period. I would certainly applaud that. Mexico has engaged in wage repression for decades and really has a shameful record in Latin America. But what is his political strategy for doing that? Because it's easy to talk about this, but low wages are really a linchpin of the Mexican political economy. How does he get over the opposition that initiative would certainly engender? And second, labor productivity has also been stagnant or stagnating for many years. What is his strategy in that regard as well?
Thanks.
Okay, so you're right. It's I also do believe in this idea of explaining the political economy of the wage repression, and the idea of initiating a move towards an increase in the minimum wage goes into convincing business people that it is important to increase the purchasing power of the Mexican population, that it is important to improve poverty levels, to reduce violence, that eventually that violence affects, it's a cost to firms. So if you, it's a connecting channel towards the cost reduction through crime. So you can incorporate more people to work, because it's so low. It's a poverty wage, minimum wage. It cannot you cannot afford food for a family of 2 with the minimum wage. So that would be trying to convince how crucial is to increase the minimum wage. We're not talking about a huge increases. It's increases good enough as for guarantee a minimum subsistence, and the importance of reducing poverty would have on the economy and on the consumption levels of the Mexican economy. Labor productivity has been decreasing, but the participation of labor in GDP has also decreased. That means that there is need to increase education, and there is a need to incorporate new technologies in education, new sorts of ways to train people. And that's why some of the programs in the Ministry of the Economy is precisely in training. It's not only about innovation. It's not innovation-led growth, but also it's adapting new technologies and adopting existing technologies. We do believe that the minimum wage can be increased, not by decree, but by sectoral spillovers. That's why also we support the idea of wage increases in NAFTA, in the auto industry, because there would be spillovers to other high-end industries, and that would be that would be a pull effect on the rest of the wage scale. So by having wage increases in NAFTA and taking into the implementation of that a very closely policy closely related to the auto sector could be also important for other sectors.
Do you mind if we take a couple questions this time so that we can get through? It seems like we still have several. So Antonio Ortiz Mena, and then we'll move up this direction.
Thank you. It's not about trade. No, I would like to learn about your views on two related issues. The first one, income inequality in Mexico. As many people know, Mexico is one of the most unequal countries, as expressed maybe the Gini index. So what are your views on that and any policies to address it? And secondly, what about regional inequalities? People that follow Mexico also know that Puebla, Oaxaca, Guerrero are very poor states, and the difference between the north and center and the south has increased since NAFTA. I personally believe we need more NAFTA, but I wanted to see what you think about regional inequalities and what, if anything, are the policies to address those issues.
Thank you. And then next one.
So 2 weeks ago, AMLO published...
If you could use the microphone, please. Thank you.
2 weeks ago...
And briefly introduce yourself, sorry.
Pablo Villanueva from Rocco's Capital. 2 weeks ago, AMLO published a letter to investors in which he said that he judged convenient that any new NAFTA agreement was signed after the July 1st election. Do you agree with that? Do you think the NAFTA agreement should wait until at least after the NAFTA election, after the Mexican election? And second, if an agreement is not reached before July 1st and AMLO wins the election, how would you want to engage? Would you want to engage in the negotiation between July 1st and December 1st during the lame duck period? Or do you believe the negotiation should simply be stopped until the new government enters? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So income inequality is partially addressed, but not solely addressed by minimum wage increases, but there should be other income policies that would raise income levels in poor sectors of the society, and particularly part of the platform is moving away from only distributing direct support to poor populations to implement some productive training in poor communities. So it is particularly part of the proposal has to do with the implementation of cooperatives in poor rural communities and to, for instance, build pavement roads from poor rural communities into national highways. So sometimes it's very difficult even to distribute aid. No, the earthquakes in last September was a a good example of that. In many communities, aid couldn't be distributed, not because of the effects of the earthquake, but because there was no roads, and everything had to be distributed by helicopter, or it took several days to reach the communities. So building roads would be a part of this strategy. But perhaps more pressing is the regional inequality. Regional inequality was not a product, an exclusive product by NAFTA. Actually, it became to widen, the gaps widen way before NAFTA, in the mid-1980s. So what we see, what we want to do here is to implement regional projects, strong regional projects in different regions. For instance, building a tourist train that goes from Cancun to the middle of to Palenque in the Chiapas jungle. That would create jobs around touristic sites and jobs around the southern border of Mexico. Then another regional project that connects, or more than connects, that revitalizes the connection between the port of Salina Cruz and Coatzacoalcos, that precisely connects two very poor states, Oaxaca and Veracruz, and a project connecting or enhancing the manufacturing sites in the Bajío region, and another regional projects that takes into account the peculiarities of the populations. For instance, you cannot now, as in the short run, you cannot try to implement a manufacturing hub in the middle of the Chiapas jungle, but it makes sense to connect that with the tourist experience of the Cancun area. So we're trying to see projects that would alleviate poverty with the resources pertaining the communities. And that's why NAFTA is so important in terms of how would affect if the new NAFTA have any effects on regional inequality. So far, we haven't seen any effect, but I think there is a variable to take into account, the regional inequality variable. Pablo, on the timing of NAFTA. NAFTA is moving every day. So should we wait until the political processes in Canada, in Mexico, and in the United States, the expiration of the TPA? There is certain different reasons why NAFTA is now in a rush. I think because the goal is to reach the best agreement possible, I think if the political noise is rushing, is pressing to not to achieve that goal, I think then the negotiation should be left for the next government. But also, you have to be clear that you cannot be negotiating NAFTA all the time. It's like accepting the sunset clause before the NAFTA is signed. So you have to be very clear, when do you want, I mean, at minimum time frame for closing the negotiations. So if NAFTA is signed in May, we would be prepared to implement NAFTA. If NAFTA is not signed in May or in June, I think it would be best to complete the negotiation when the new government is, just in terms of how to implement NAFTA. On the other hand, but this is our preferences. what I really want to transmit is that we're prepared for any scenario. One thing is our preferences, and one thing is what would happen. In any case, we will be prepared for the implementation. We will be prepared for the negotiation.
Thank you very much. Take a couple more questions. And want to make sure we get on both sides of the room. So we'll take your question, right? Well, okay, and we'll take all three there. Andrew, Guy, and then over here as well.
Thank you. So I'm Andrew Redmond with Monarch Global Strategies. There's a pretty clear relationship between productivity and health of the population, and one where Mexico is behind some of its comparator countries. In fact, the current government has reduced the public health care budget on a couple occasions in the sexenio. That seems somewhat different than some of the steps that AMLO took while he was mayor. I was just curious if I realize you're the incoming or the potential Secretary of Economy, not Secretary of Health, but if you could talk a little bit about your views or AMLO's views on that nexus between economy and health.
Thanks. If you could pass the mic to your right, thanks.
Guy Erb, I have a comment on the graph. I think you're giving too much weight to the crisis years of the early 80s and not enough to the period after the tequilazo of 94, 95. But apart from that, there are three factors which we really haven't addressed adequately: crime, corruption, and the courts. Too much of the first two and not enough of the other. Allowing for the fact that the U.S. is directly responsible for a good part of the crime on both sides of the border, what are your policies toward reducing crime, eliminating or at least reducing the corruption which has plagued the government for many, many years, and the reform of the court system, the judicial review?
Thanks. And then back over here, we had a question.
Hi, Gregory Kist with APCO Worldwide. You mentioned the importance of digital technology in reducing informality in the economy. I was just wondering where AMLO stands regarding the recently passed fintech law and whether there is a need for additional regulation beyond that.
Thank you.
Okay, on productivity and health, there is proposals to supply the Mexican public health system. Yeah, I was looking for your face. The Mexican public system provides medicine as part of the attention, and it's usually under supply. And one of the main goals for the health ministry is to have that, to regularize the supply of medicine, because it's not enough just to go to the doctor and that the doctor tells you that you need to buy your medicine. It's just also to provide when needed. So it would be very, very. It's an issue that it's been taken into account, and even, I mean, a simple measure as that all public officials would not have any private health insurance. When we have these meetings, Lopez Obrador always refers to, okay, now that you are going to the IMSS or to the ISSSTE, then you would know that the service, you need to report to the health minister how is the service and how the service is doing. I think, I mean, that is just a simple line, but I think it involves you into the service you're providing, because if you have your private health paid by the government, then you don't care about the public. So that may speak of the importance given to the health issues, and also he has asked the minister to there are some hospitals and some clinics that are being built or were built in the past, but they are not working. And they are not working because the government go there and say, oh, this is the new facility, but they don't budget money for doctors and nurses. So we might not need to invest in many new facilities, but if you hire doctors and nurses and supply medicines, then you would see a change, a significant change in the first 2 years of the government. You're right, absolutely, but I was not avoiding these troubles. Quite the contrary. Actually, AMLO believes that crime and corruption is at the center of the Mexican problems. So on crime, it should be no impunity. The idea of trying to organize, trying to implement training for police corps, training for those who prosecute crimes should be at the center of the strategy. And in terms of corruption, transparency and no impunity for those who commit corrupt actions could be, again, at the center of the strategy. We believe that there are nowadays there are many instruments in which you can reduce corruption. You can simply follow the money, no? I mean, it's the basic, the 101 strategy, but beyond the 101 strategy, you can also use digital technologies for corrupt practices. So it's more a matter of implementing what is already in the law. Actually, we don't need many laws. In many of the reforms proposed by Lopez Obrador, we don't need to go to Congress for new laws. Mexico had good laws, but we need to implement that, to use them in favor of growth. And on the judicial reform, it would be, again, more training and more educating the public. One thing that Lopez Obrador has said is that he plans to use official time in TV and mostly on TV for small capsules asking academics to explain things on the TV. Not instead of the president inaugurated such and such, or the president did such and such, trying to see what is transparency. And imagine on a TV, what is transparency, or on the radio? Transparency is such and such. So we really need to make a regime change. It's not a government change. It's a regime change in which we Mexicans reject completely any corrupt act.
Fantastic. There's one part on fintech. I don't know if you had anything on
I'm sorry.
financial technology you wanted to add in.
No, the law was recently passed, I guess in early March, and announced in the bankers meeting, association meeting. So far, there is no. I haven't heard anything from the Finance Ministry, Carlos Ursúa, but he would be in town in May, and so he might be more knowledgeable than me on fintech.
Thanks. Very short on time, but I know, Jason, you had something you wanted to throw in, and then we'll see if we can
last
catch one
item,
more, maybe.
We're almost done here. Just first of all, Graciela, thank you very much for all your comments and your clarity. A quick question. If AMLO's elected, what would you recommend should be the first steps that he should take as president-elect to inject investor confidence, both domestic and international, in a new government? What would be the first signs you would recommend that first steps he should do to have that confidence if he's elected?
Well, actually, it's I don't know if it could be the very first one after the Zócalo celebration. The very first one on July the 2nd, I think is preparing the budget. So, I mean, if you show where the money is going, I think that would be a very important statement. So we are already working on, every secretary is working on budget, and preparing on really reducing bureaucracy. So that would be one of the first, so that would give a sense of the fiscal responsibility that he's always talking about. So that would be, I guess, it's not a single act, but it would be the process of budget, the presentation of the budget for 2019.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time, unfortunately, in terms of more questions. But let me just say, in sense of closing, we trade over $500 billion between the United States and Mexico. As you've been pointing out here, there's such a deep connection between not only our economies, but also our cultures. There are some 12 million Mexicans living in the United States, 1 million Americans living in Mexico. We did a study and found that there are 5 million American jobs that depend on trade with Mexico. There's such a deep connection between our countries, and that's why we here in the United States care so much about what's going on in Mexico. And as you see, that's why we have so many questions about what might come during various potential administrations after these elections in Mexico. So it's really important for you and the various campaigns and teams to come up here and take the time to speak with us, to share some insight into not just what might happen, but why it would happen, the way you're thinking about certain challenges. So once again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Thanks to Jason and the Atlantic Council for partnering with us on this. Thanks to Stephen and McClarty for helping arrange this and make this happen. Thanks to all of you for being here today and showing your interest as well.
Well, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. And if someone has questions, you can write me and I'll be sure to answer your questions. Graciela.marquez.colin@gmail.com.
Mil gracias.
Spanish in Spanish.
That's
Okay.
fine.
Bye.